All right, here we go. Yes, we're recordings in progress. This is episode 37 or 38, I forget. And we're doing Just This by Richard Rohr, and we're going to be starting on, let's see. Oh, shoot. 59, right? Yes, 59, page 59. Emptying the mind and filling the heart. So,
Wait, isn't it
no, that's not
58?
right. Is that right?
58.
58.
That's
She
right.
said,
Mutually loving gaze. You see, I got my bookmark in the wrong place. I hate when that happens. Okay, mutually loving gaze, page 58. Good thing I have you guys to keep me straight, keep me accountable. Hey, is there anything from last week, anything you've been thinking about this week that you want to bring up before we dive in? That sounds like a big negatory. Nothing? Going once, going twice. All right. Okay, so we're going to be starting into this mutually loving gaze. We're still in chapter 2. We talked about the great river and the riverbed of mercy before that. He's kind of getting more into the actual nuts and bolts. When he gets into emptying the mind and filling the heart, next section, you can start to feel him really getting more into actual technique and what it is we're doing when we're trying to enter contemplative space. So at any rate, let's take a look at a mutually loving gaze. Much of the early work of contemplation is discovering a way to observe yourself from a compassionate and non-judgmental distance until you can eventually live more and more of your life from this calm inner awareness and acceptance. You will find yourself smiling, sighing, weeping at yourself, much more than needing either to hate or congratulate yourself, because you're finally looking at yourself with the eyes of God. Actually, what is happening is that you're letting God gaze at you in the way only God can gaze, with infinite mercy and love, which initiates a positive gaze, now going in both directions. Wow. All negative energy and motivation will slowly be exposed and will eventually fall away as counterproductive and useless. There will be no mistrust, fear, or negativity in either direction. If you resort to any form of shaming yourself, you will slip back into defense, denial, and overcompensation, and you will not be able to know as fully as you are known. But if you can connect with the indwelling presence where the spirit bears common witness with our spirit, it can and will change your life. This mutually loving gaze is always initiated by God and grace. Once you learn to rest there, nothing less will ever satisfy you. This is foundational. Okay, any initial comments, questions, things that stood out?
Well, I'll just reiterate what the second paragraph ended with. Wow. It's pretty powerful.
That says a lot coming from Sri Lanka. You know that, of course. Anything else stand out or confound? Nobody's confounded. That's good.
I think for me, it's the to love yourself the way God loves us is the key to take away all this guilt and shame and sense of duty and obligation. And it's actually freeing to be yourself, to accept yourself
Yeah.
despite our faults, and others, to accept others too.
So we're getting back to what we talked about on Sunday. Acceptance is the answer, right? So much comes right back down to acceptance. It's amazing. All right, well, let's take it from the top then. See what we can do here. So much of the early work of contemplation is discovering a way to observe yourself from a compassionate and non-judgmental distance until you can eventually live more and more of your life from this calm inner awareness and acceptance. There's the word again, acceptance, right? So we've got this idea, again, that idea of the watcher. We've talked about this over and over again, but I think it's good to talk about it over and over again because it's such a hard concept for us to try to just get our heads wrapped around. And really, seriously, until you've experienced it, it's going to remain, really, it remains elusive even after you've experienced it. But, before you've experienced the difference between that two, the stepping away from the egoic and into this more expansive space, it's really difficult to try to really conceive of cognitively. But this way to observe yourself from a compassionate and non-judgmental distance. And that's really what it's all about. It's just getting that space that allows you to kind of see the workings of your mind and see a lot of the triggers that cause the predictable thought patterns or behavior patterns. And so you can kind of see the workings of the whole thing. And it's kind of like this aha moment where the light bulb goes on. I said, oh, I remember when I was first starting centering prayer, and well, it was a ways into it. And I remembered reading Keating, Thomas Keating, who said that the insights that you will get, the connections that you'll get from centering prayer or contemplative prayer are not going to be during the meditational sit, not during the prayer sit itself, but at random times during the day. And darn if that isn't exactly the way it happened. I'd go through the centering prayer, and yes, it would feel relaxing and feel peaceful, but it also felt like nothing, absolutely nothing was happening. It was frustrating because I didn't feel like anything was going on. I must not be doing it right. And I didn't have anyone to tell me otherwise. But then over time, then stuff would start to bubble up just randomly throughout the day. Memories that I forgot, usually unpleasant ones, I would remember. And then there would be this line that would connect it to the thought patterns and the behavior patterns. And so kind of like doing your own psychoanalysis in a certain way, but it was completely just from an observational point of view. It wasn't like I was trying to do anything. Stuff would just start bubbling up. But to be able to see yourself from that space and be able to it's a weird thing because it's you, and then it feels like it's not you, sort of at the same time, that little bit of space that you get. But that's the idea here. We're spending time in this place where we are consciously and intentionally and strategically stepping away from the workings of our minds so that we can start to get a sense of the overall picture. What all is going on? What is this mix between our minds and the way they work and this deeper self that cannot be put into words? And it was really interesting. And then he says, you will find yourself smiling, sighing, weeping at yourself, much more than needing either to hate or to congratulate yourself, because you're finally looking at yourself with the eyes of God. Here's where that unoffendability and unflatterability can come into play here. It goes right back to that story that I love to tell from the Desert Fathers and Mothers of the young monk who goes to the elder and asks how he can get closer to God. And he tells him to go to the cemetery and insult the dead. I know you've heard this one before. And then he tells him to go praise the dead. And when he does all that, and he said, finally, when you can react to the insults and the praises of men the way the dead do, then you're becoming closer to God. This is exactly what happens in centering prayer. You get to the point where you're seeing yourself realistically. And so you're not thinking too highly of yourself, but you're not thinking low of yourself either. Humility is being able to see yourself as you actually are. And you see yourself in relationship as you actually are. And so it gives you that distance enough that the guilt, the shame, all that kind of stuff, either coming from yourself or coming from others, doesn't stick in the same way. Because you're seeing from a different perspective, a different point of view. And then also, you're not going to get a big head over the whole thing either, because now you're starting to develop what Jesus called poverty of spirit. To be poor in spirit is to inherit the kingdom, as he said in the first beatitude. And now we know that that means just a right-centeredness. It doesn't mean that you don't have spiritual gifts in a negative way. It just means, again, that humility, that ability to have an attitude of poverty, even if you're rich, all of that. This is what we're developing in contemplative practice. Any thoughts about that? I want to show you guys something, and you can judge whether this helps or not. If it doesn't, then just forget the next 5 minutes entirely. Just, wipe them out of your memory. Brady, are you a Jungian by any chance?
Pretty much.
I'm sorry, yes? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, well then you're going to love this, man. I'm going to have you on my side. Okay, so this is, you can all see that?
Yeah.
So this is just a little article on the analytical psychology of Carl Jung. And what I wanted to do is just read you a little bit of the introduction, because Jung's concept of individuation is pretty much exactly what we're talking about here. And to see it maybe from a psychological point of view, maybe can help us with the whole idea of what we're trying to do here. So just starting with the introduction, for Jung, the psyche was the great world within. For him, this interior world was just as great as the world without, and indeed embodied much of the world without. For Jung, life was also a great mystery, of which we understand very little. He never hesitated to say, I don't know, and readily admitted when he came to the end of his understanding. The human condition today. This is an interesting quote. Modern man is even more sick in the normality than in the asylum. He is a man in search of his soul. The last thing Jung wanted to do was to merely remove a person's sense of maladjustment. Think about that for a second. The last thing he wanted to do as a psychologist, psychiatrist, psychotherapist was to remove a person's sense of maladjustment. Mankind is in great danger, and the only solution is to become more conscious. That's exactly what contemplation is about. It's developing awareness. It's developing your consciousness so you can get this space that Frankl talked about as the space between the stimulus and the response. That is the space where we can grow. So we need to become more conscious. The only real danger that exists is man himself. He is the real danger. Jung was reacting to the mass psychology of fascism and communism. Remember when he came up, he was born in 1875. He died in 1961, I think. So his golden years were right in the mid-century when all this craziness was happening. His comments apply equally to the terrorism and the eco-crisis. We have forgotten how to live the symbols in ourselves. He was big on the unconscious, of course, and on dreams and dream analysis. Now, this concept of individuation, Jung believed that a human being is inwardly whole, but that most of us have lost touch with important parts of ourselves. Through listening to the messages of our dreams and waking imagination, we can contact and reintegrate our different parts. The goal of life is individuation, the process of coming to know, giving expression to, and harmonizing the various components of the psyche. If we realize our uniqueness, we can undertake a process of individuation and tap into our true self. Each human being has a specific nature and calling, which is uniquely his or her own. And unless these are fulfilled through a union of conscious and unconscious, the person can become sick. Okay, think of all that he's saying there. We're whole. Isn't that what we're talking about when we talk about the soul from a theological point of view? We have this interior wholeness. Jesus tells us the kingdom is within. It's already here. You don't need to go looking for it. The way that we realize kingdom in ourselves is to remove all the parts of ourselves that are blocking it. Basically the same thing that he's talking here. We need to become whole again. We're already whole there, but we need to bring all the parts back together and start to live with some integrity. He writes that individuation means becoming a single, homogeneous being. And insofar as individuality embraces our innermost, last, and incomparable uniqueness, it also implies becoming one's own self. We could therefore translate individuation as coming to selfhood or self-realization. And this last bullet point is great. Often the ego is misidentified with the self. Individuation is then seen as nothing but ego-centeredness. See that? If we think the voice that's talking to us in our head is ourselves, then this whole process that we're going to do, I mean, so many people go down the religious road, go down the spiritual road, but really all they're doing is reinforcing the ego because they haven't made that split yet. It's still a very egoic process. And we see that, you know, in the way that religion is being perpetrated. And I use that word purposefully. And in individuals who it's still a very egoic process until we realize that there's something deeper and that the true process is exactly what Jesus said, is to step away from, to lose sense of self in order to gain our lives. There's a couple other passages that I thought would be good to take a look at. His idea of the archetypes is important. For him, you know, dreams are windows into the unconscious, and they're giving us messages from the unconscious that if we can pay attention to them, can help us to do this reintegration or individuation process. But he talks about the shadow, and we've talked about that before when we did the book on Owning Your Shadow by Johnson. But this is a little blip that I think is really good in the way that he lays it out. The shadow is the side of our personality which we do not consciously display in public. It may have positive or negative qualities. If it remains unconscious, the shadow is often projected onto other individuals or groups. The real bad dude, for example, may push his friendly, nourishing sides into the shadow. So the important thing about the shadow is it's not evil. It's not even dark, and it's not necessarily negative. It's just what we have disavowed. It's what we do not acknowledge. It's what we do not consciously allow anybody else to see. And that can be acculturated in us from early childhood, from the culture around us, or just our family. Whatever we were punished for, or whatever did not give us proper results as we were growing up, then gets pushed into the shadow. We don't show that anymore because it doesn't do us any good. It's not to our advantage. And it could be positive traits, it could be negative traits. It doesn't really matter. What matters is until we reintegrate all that, until we actually do own the shadow, first acknowledge it, and then find a way to, if it's negative energy that's in the shadow, dissipate it through healthy ritual or other channels so that it doesn't go in negative ways in projecting on other people. He says, the third bullet point down, the narrow and more restrictive the society in which we live, the larger will be our shadow. The shadow is unavoidable and we are incomplete without it. It is in the nature of human life that there should be light, dark, sun, shade, laughter, and sorrow. Superstition holds that the person without a shadow is the devil himself. That's pretty interesting. We are cautious with someone too good to be true. And then you've got the anima and animus, and this is another interesting part. So anima and animus are personifications of the feminine nature of a man's unconscious and the masculine nature of a woman's. This psychological bisexuality is a reflection of the biological fact that it is the larger number of male or female genes which is the decisive factor in the determination of sex. Anima and animus manifest themselves most typically in personified form as figures in dreams and fantasies, the dream girl or the dream lover, or in irrationalities of a man's feelings and a woman's thinking. As regulators of behavior, they are two of the most influential archetypes. The animus and the anima should function as a bridge or a door leading to the images of the collective unconscious, as a persona should be a sort of bridge into the world. All of this needs to be reintegrated. You know, when we talk about God as either male or female, you know, obviously it's neither and both at the same time. And each one of us, whether we are male or female biologically, we still have the other side of ourselves that needs to be reintegrated, just like the yin and the yang. So all of this needs to come back together again. Now, he worked on it through therapies and his analysis, a lot of dream work and so on and so forth. We're talking about doing it through contemplative practice. But the way through is really the same. I keep saying that Jesus was a psychologist way before his time. He operates in such good psychological practice in terms of what it is he's trying to get us to do in order to be able to move through this process. So I don't know if that helps you or not, if it really confused things. Like I said, just forget the last 5 or 10 minutes. But I hope it gave you just another facet of this, another way of looking at it, so you kind of see what it is. We're trying to reintegrate our whole that has been shattered into pieces. And we don't even realize it because we're living within the bubble of the egoic conscious mind. And we're not even aware all this is going on. We don't understand, like Paul so beautifully said, don't understand why we can't do the things we want to do and keep doing the things we don't want to do, and how that just gets all back to front. It's because we're working against the unconscious and all of those disavowed parts of our personality. All right, that was a bunch of stuff. Any thoughts or shares on that?
Is that something you could send out with the email, Dave? So
Would you
we
like
could
to see
read it?
that, the whole article?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really
Mm-hmm.
good. You did a good job of condensing it down. Sure. I'll send it out with the email, or the email that I send out with
A
the
couple
link.
interesting things about Jung. I mean, he would not hesitate to say, "I don't know." Yeah, he talked about ambiguity and the ability to live with it. But he was asked on radio once if he believed in God, if he thought God existed, and his answer was, "I know God exists." Well, that's significant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, he came from a whole family of parsons. He grew up amongst religion and spirituality, and so he's an interesting person.
Very interesting, very deep, and very psychological, but also very theological in the way he approaches things. He does a treatment on Job that's just crazy.
Yes.
Yes.
You read the
Wow.
book?
I've read
Answer to
parts of it,
Job?
but I haven't read the whole thing. Yeah. Yeah. But it's pretty wild stuff. Now he doesn't shrink away from anything. I mean, he just wades right in. But but the way that what's interesting to me, and that's why I try to bring things from different traditions and even different philosophies, because when it comes to the truth, there's only one. There's only one truth. There's only one God. There's one truth. And so we're all approaching it maybe from different paths and calling things by different names. But when you get close enough to the truth, you start to see the common thread. And so when I read something like this from Jung, I'm seeing what Jesus is talking about, which means I'm also seeing what the Taoists are talking about, what the Buddhists are talking about, because all of this, it's the same thing that we're looking at, but we're looking at it from different paths. And it's just as Jesus said, it's just one thing. If we just seek the kingdom, then everything else is going to be added. And seeking the kingdom is seeking presence. And seeking presence means that we're going through this process of stepping away from the egoic mind. When we are truly present, we are no longer bound by the egoic mind that only thinks in comparisons and contrasts and in this limited language that we can formulate. And once we're free of that and we're in this expansive space, everything changes. And that's where the sense of okayness comes in. That's where that happiness comes in that we've been talking about the last few weeks. But it's this process. Seek that first, everything else starts to fall into place. And it doesn't happen all at once, but it will happen. But it's just so beautiful to me and fascinating that you can see it in all these different traditions. And it really helps, I think, sometimes to see it in different language than the language of scripture that we're so familiar with, that either we don't see it at all or we already have a preconceived notion of what it means.
It's a very Jungian thing to say to someone, "Don't mistake yourself for your mind." So you establish this thought of there's a separation. There's an observer. There's a discerner, but it's not the egoic mind.
Yeah.
You can just kind of start there and go from there.
And of course, Rohr has quoted Jung many times, in other books that we've read. So he's following along those lines as well, trying to get the same point across. So this is all by way of understanding what the contemplative process is about, what contemplative practice is, and how we're going to be moving into it. So hopefully that helps somewhat. So let's go on here. He says, actually, what is happening is you are letting God gaze at you in the only way God can gaze, with infinite mercy and love, which initiates a positive gaze, now going in both directions. He says, wow. So in the last line of the paragraph before, he says, you will find yourself smiling and sighing and weeping at yourself, much more than needing either to hate or congratulate yourself, because you're finally looking at yourself with the eyes of God. And then he says, what's actually happening is you're letting God gaze at you in the only way that God can gaze, with infinite mercy and love, which initiates a positive gaze going in both directions. When we move into this deeper space, when we're no longer looking through the judgments of our egoic mind, then we can start to see everything as God sees it, see everything as Jesus saw it, as one thing. You know, yes, Jesus came to minister to the Jewish nation. That was his stated mission, and he stuck with it. He never deviated from that in his life. But when a person was in front of him, he made no distinctions of whether they were Jew or Gentile or Pharisee or Sadducee or anything else. He treated them with the same amount of presence and the same amount of attention and consideration. Yes, he would come in conflict with some of them, you know, if he needed to, but he still had the same consideration for them. And that's because he was seeing things from this perspective, this expansive perspective, and it changes things. And that's what we're trying to do, is if we can see the things the way God sees, then it opens up. Now we're all not only narrowly looking through what's lawful and what's unlawful, or even what's moral or what's not. You know, how many times have we asked the question in here, is lying always wrong? And of course, the answer that we eventually come up with is no, it's not. Sometimes it is the most healing thing that you can do if you're preserving life and you're preserving relationship. It's unlawful, but it's not wrong. And the only way we're going to know the difference is if we are fully present in the moment and we have moved into Rumi's field, right? Beyond right doing and wrongdoing, and are just present to what's going on so that we can bring our whole selves to the equation and choose what we truly believe love requires in that moment. Changes everything. But we have to be seeing with God's eyes. And when we do that, you know, like he said, the gaze is going both ways. You know, God sees us, we see God, and we're seeing us ourselves with that same non-judgmental, loving gaze. So there isn't that shame that we sometimes are just inculcated with, you know, but that infinite mercy and love initiates a positive gaze, as Rohr puts it. Very different kind of experience. He continues, all negative energy and motivation will slowly be exposed and will eventually fall away as counterproductive and useless. So this negative energy and motivation, you know what, a lot of that is the projection of the shadow onto others, projection of the shadow onto the circumstances around us. You know, the shadow will out one way or another. It's down there and it's coming out. You know, the question is it going to come out consciously or unconsciously? If it comes out unconsciously, then it's probably going to be damaging because it's going to be projected. The parts of yourself that you can't own up to, the parts of yourself that you're keeping in the back bedroom with the door locked, are going to be projected onto others, and you're going to hate them for what you're really afraid of in yourself or not willing to own. And so to avoid all that is to bring the shadow side up to the light, admit that it's, and accept that it's a part of who you are, and then find ways to expiate it. If it's a positive in you that has been, you know, pushed down because of the way that you grew up and people didn't appreciate you being the smartest person in the room, People didn't appreciate your talent. People didn't appreciate your gregariousness or whatever it was. And as a child, all that got put down because mom and dad didn't like it. Well, now it's the time to let it out and let it do its positive work in your life, allow you to be able to move into new ventures and do things with different energy. If it's negative and harmful, then you find ritualistic ways to be able to expiate that. But we have to know that it's part of us, and we have to own it and integrate it and find ways to be able to, let all that energy play out in one way or another. In the process of this contemplative practice, all that has a chance to play out. So this negative energy and motivation will slowly be exposed. It bubbles up, during your days, and eventually will fall away as counterproductive and useless. He says there will be no mistrust, fear, or negativity in either direction, either toward God or towards you, toward others, toward yourself. If you resort to any form of shaming yourself, you will slip back into defense, denial, and overcompensation, and you will not be able to know as fully as you are known. And he's referencing 1 Corinthians 13:12 there, which, if you remember, 1 Corinthians 13 is the famous love chapter, but at the end, he has that passage where he says, when as a child, I acted as a child, and so on and so forth. But now that I'm a man, I act as a man. And then the final line that he's quoting here is that, right now we see through the glass darkly, or we see through the mirror as distorted, but then eventually we will see face to face, we will see clearly. And so this idea of to know fully as you are known can only happen when we can transcend all of these feelings of fear and shame and judgment and all these things that happen when we move past the egoic mind. So often I've heard people talk about when you are face to face with God at the bema seat, right? The judgment seat. And your whole life is going to be played out like a movie in front of you. And you're going to be so ashamed of the things that you did, And as I started, I just accepted that from childhood on. And it's kind of a fearful thing to think you're going to stand before God, you're going to be shamed in this way, but you probably deserve it, right? But going through this process of contemplative practice, I got to the point where it's like, I'm going to be standing in the presence of absolute love personified. What do you think I'm going to feel at that moment? Certainly isn't going to be shame. It certainly isn't going to be fear. It's going to be what Brady felt on the other side of that line. It's going to be perfect acceptance and connection. How can it be anything else if you're standing in the presence of absolute perfect love personified? This idea of shame is something that is contained in the egoic mind. Does that mean that we can't sin, quote unquote, in terms of harming each other? Of course not. Yes, we can do that. And the proper emotion for that is guilt, which is the motivator, the awareness that we did something wrong. We don't want to do that anymore. And we need to make it right as much as we can and move on. But that doesn't mean that we ourselves are broken and evil. As both Jung is saying and Jesus is saying, is that we are whole inside. It's all the stuff that's been piled on egoically that makes us act out in all these harmful ways. If we can get back to the source, we can get back to the purity. All right. How many theological feathers is all that ruffling for y'all? None? Really?
All of them.
Okay, well, give some voice to that, Tony. What's going on?
No, it sounds like, and I'm gonna stretch it here a little bit, that the more I stay out of the way, the better off I'm gonna be.
Wait, say that again?
The more I stay out of the way of myself, the better off I'm gonna be. In other words, I need to be a minimal, um, I don't know how to put it in words, a minimal, thoughtless, maybe. but a maximum trusting individual in God. I need to learn to trust God without reservation, and then believing in that I can't stand face to face with him, and know that he is ready to embrace me with his love and his mercy. Yeah, that's why it ruffles on my feathers.
That doesn't sound like
Like,
they're
wow.
ruffled. Sounds like they're getting smoothed down, man.
Yeah, no, it's calming. It is very calming, but it's yeah. I recently heard somebody, a newscaster, talk about, I'm not judging it, that people that are minimal information voters. And part of me is like, wow, like something inside of them says, this is how I'm going to vote. They don't need a whole lot. And almost like, it's like, I want to be a minimal information Christian, right? It's like, okay, this is not that complicated. Just don't get in the way, and just allow me to and learn to trust.
You're absolutely right, Tony. I love the way you just put that, minimal information. Here's the thing. Most of our theologies that we learn and have inherited, either generationally or within our own experience, has been built up by very complex theories and theologies and so on and so forth. So if we're going to tear them back down again and get back to that minimalist place you're talking about, back down to ground zero, we have to use the same tools that we use to build it up in order to bring it back down again, or it's not going to be seen as a legitimate process for those of us who are inculcated into the faith, right? And so, yes, it needs to get maybe even a little more complex for a while, but the goal is always to move through the complexity back to the simplicity. And you're absolutely right. Jesus' message is absolutely simple. It's just pristine and it's perfectly clear. But we have a lot of work to do to get back to that simplicity, because there's been all this accrual for 2,000 years, and we want to get back to the clarity. But if we are in the complexity, then yeah, we're still in the midst of the journey. We haven't gotten back to the simplicity yet, but we do want to get there, and there's value to that process. But if you haven't been built up in a faith like that, well, then the process is much easier because you have so much less to unlearn. And you can approach it directly.
Right.
I mean, John Gibson, Crazy John, John the Baptist, he's a perfect example. When he got to the effect, he had no experience in church at all. He managed to get through, 60 years without any kind of church experience. And he was just hit with the love, and that's all he wants. It's just the love, and don't bother me with all this other stuff. He's not here. He's not interested in having this kind of conversation. It's just about the love, right? And so he's been able to approach things in kind of a different way, but that's unusual. Most of us need to go through a curve to get there, but where we want to get back to is the purity of it all. The good news about going through a process like this, though, is that we can then help people going through the same process. We'll have the words that we can speak to them about what the process looks like, how it works. We can answer questions. We can be a more efficient guide or effective guide than the intuitive leap or someone who didn't have to go through the process. And there's value in that too. But we do want to stop worshiping at the altar of complexity. That's for certain and true. Yeah.
Yeah, John's nailed it, right? It's all about the love.
Yeah.
And he's just simplified that process. And that's enough.
I was thinking about that minimal, what Tony you said about that minimal thinking something
Minimal information.
minimal information. Okay. To me, I can see it being two ways, either beneficial or not. It's negative. The beneficial part, well, okay, I go to the negative first. This is like herd mentality. Okay, everybody's doing it, so I'm gonna follow through. I'm too lazy or not, I don't have the capacity to have critical thinking. So I'm gonna go with the herd, which is negative, right? But the other part of that too is if I see myself as I don't have the capacity to understand this complex thing, but this person does. This person who is smarter than me or has more knowledge than me, is more abstract thinking. I'm going to trust this person's judgment and say, well, okay, if he or she agrees with this or comports with this, then fine, then I put that trust of that person's judgment and say, oh, okay, then I will follow that person's decision. You understand? Because I recognize I'm not smart enough to make that decision, so I trust that person to do that and I follow suit.
Okay, so if I understand you, are you saying that that is a good thing to do? To be able to lean on your teachers that way?
Yeah, that could be
Okay.
the good thing. Other negative thing for that is I'm too lazy or I don't want to put that effort to look into something, and so I go with the herd mentality.
Okay, let me dispel one thing that may be implicit in what we were just talking about with this minimal information bit. And that's that if you're going to approach this in simplicity, that doesn't mean that there's less work to do. That doesn't mean that the path is going to be easier. What it does mean is that the path is going to move in a different direction. Even if you're going to approach Jesus' message in the pure simplicity that it is, you still have to have the experience. You still need to go through the process, the contemplative process. To lose your life so that you can find it is the hardest thing that you will ever do. You know, the intellectual part, that's just mind candy. And if it helps funnel you into the actual experience of what it means to lose your life the way Jesus is talking about it, then it's all worthwhile. But only if, because all that stuff is just boosters on the rocket that you're going to jettison as soon as you get into orbit. You're not going to need that stuff anymore. The theology and the doctrine and all that, it is just boosters on the rocket to get you into orbit. The real work is what happens in that contemplative practice, in that time of contemplative prayer, as you are moving into this space that we're talking about here. That still has to be done. And if you don't do it, you're not going to be any closer to being able to live in kingdom, even though you aren't burdened down by a lot of baggage, intellectual baggage. Does that make sense? There is still the hard work that must be done, but it's not intellectual work primarily. And it's never done in order to get something that God is withholding. It's to be able to participate in the blessing that you already have and have always already had. It's already here, but we can't realize it in our lives because we're blocked so many different ways. To be able to do what Jesus' way, to live Jesus' way, is to let all of that be able to move into the background so that we can be purely present. And all that still needs to take place.
But do we all have that ability to do that?
Sure.
Yeah?
Yes, we do.
Because I find, like, talking to others, like, some find it easier to do, some
Oh yeah,
I
it's
think
going to be easier for some. Hey, it took me 10 years, Ellen, to feel like I was finally getting somewhere along the contemplative path because I worshiped my mind. I loved my mind. I still do love my mind, but I really loved my mind back then. I thought it was the be all and end all of everything. If I could just get my head around the concept, it would be mine and I would have this thing by the throat. And until I learned to let go of that and realize it has nothing to do with that, I can't make anything happen. Or as Rohr says, I can't push the river. It doesn't work that way. I could only become a part of its flow, which is to let go of all of that and realize it's a falling back and into rather than a leaning forward and trying to acquire. It took me years to be able to even get to the point where I was willing to try something like that. So yeah, it was really hard for me, and it will be hard. You know, that's why Jesus says it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom, or it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than the rich man to enter. He's talking about rich in intellect. He's talking about rich in resources. Anything that we believe is our source of power and the way that we can cling on to control, that's what's blocking us from this process. And the more of that you have in any direction, the harder it is. And so, yes, the simplest, the children, the childlike at heart are going to find it easier to move into this space. But everybody can do it. It's a question of motivation. And it's a question of finally finding out where the X is over the treasure on your map, which is ultimately what Jesus is doing for us. He's putting the X over the treasure on our maps, so we'll be digging in the right spot when we do decide to dig. Does that help at all?
I was thinking about a little bit about the example of John that we were just talking about, and he is all about the kind of the I guess you call the minimalist Christian. I mean, he's all about love, and that's simple for him. But in the same way, he's still showing up for the services. He's listening to the music. He's hearing the messages. It's sort of soaking in with him, whether he's saying any more about it or not. I mean, he's feeling it all with us, with the community. So in a way, just by showing up, he's kind of doing the work too, in some ways, even though he takes the
Absolutely.
simplistic view.
Yes.
Absolutely is. And what's it? He's pushing on 10 years now that he's been showing up. So yeah, you can't steep in the tea that long and without getting some stain on you, right?
Right.
And the wonderful thing about John too is we are able to see God's mercy and love through him. We can see that work. Like, here's the most precious thing in the world, right? John, and he's painted this for us to see and enjoy. And yet reflecting back that he does that with each and every one of us, that we are his best work. And how do I see myself in the way that God sees me? I think that's what Richard Rohr is trying to communicate here.
Yeah.
I love the whole idea of oh, there's so much that we talked about tonight, but I love like the you know when you're talking about like that, you know, the end and the judgment, and I always used to have that like, oh, I'm gonna have that sense, you know, that really strong sense of shame, but um I just makes so much more sense to me when you put it that way. It just makes so much more sense. It seems like all of that was just a shadow projections probably. And I really like the second paragraph too when he says we're letting God gaze at us. It's like we're, you know, I mean, he can see all of us and inside and out of us, but we don't want him to see us because we're so ashamed, you know. But that's all just those are all just baggage and shadows and delusions, and it feels really so relieving. This whole chapter is just really relieving for me. It's just really heartfelt and a beautiful truth. It's really nice.
And doesn't that put a whole nother spin on the Genesis story of Adam and Eve?
Yeah.
As soon as they eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they run and put the fig leaves on, and they're hiding from God because they're so ashamed. And God says, who told you to be ashamed? You know, who told you you were naked? But that's exactly what the ego does to us. You know, the egoic mind, which is the mark of our self-awareness of the part of us that is created in God's image, at the same time gives us the ability to think shamefully, you know, and that's the part that we need to re-transcend. You know, our whole goal is to get back to the garden, to that place, you know, where we can be completely one with. But this time when we do it, not as a child does it involuntarily, now we're doing it with volition. We're choosing to do this. We're bringing our whole self-awareness with us, but we're choosing to then let it go. that self-emptying, the kenosis that Paul talks about in Jesus, is a voluntary act, and not just because the synapses haven't closed yet. It's a whole different trip. But it's just when you start to put scripture into this context, you realize the absolute unbelievable genius of the language and the imagery, and how it conveys in no way that prose could ever do the human experience of what this is all about.
Yeah. About 6 months ago, I took an art class, and I painted this drawing, and it was just a cheesy class. But when I got home, and everybody's telling me, "Oh, that's really nice. That's really nice." Now I don't know how to draw. I never considered myself an artist at all, right? And I got this thing. I got it at home, and I had it across the room, and I was completely ripping on it. And then it hit me all of a sudden. Oh my gosh, look how hard I am on myself. I wasn't criticizing that drawing. I was criticizing and ripping myself. And that speaks to the hard work that you had talked about. Yeah, you could simplify it, but I still had to go through that painful understanding of what was happening inside of me, and it had nothing to do with what was outside of me. But then the love came from myself, and now I love painting and I love drawing, because I accept the fact that this is where I'm at, and this is just an expression of myself, and I accept it no matter if it looks great or it doesn't look great. It's just where I'm at. Yeah. Anyways, I think that speaks to the hard work and yet the simplification of it. We as individuals, unfortunately, because of the way we were raised, we stain up what God has created.
You're 2 for 2, Tony. Good stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, look at me.
See?
Well, that feels good.
Yeah, stop bagging on yourself. You're doing great. Let's finish this chapter so we can say we did.
Oh,
But
can I add something to Tony's really quick?
Yes, you certainly may.
Yeah, you did your painting, you're criticizing it. Let me tell you, the first time I saw this cats painting things like this, and they were selling it for auction, and they say this is art. Then I said, any of us can do that. My 3-year-old did one, and I put it side by side, and it looks similar. And they say this is art. Well, heck, all of us can do art.
Mm-hmm. It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. We won't always fetch the same price that the cats did, but we can all make it happen.
I still Tanya too has a cat. So Tanya, you are cat ladies, aren't we?
Oh, don't go there. Don't go there. Okay, very quickly, I changed subject. But if you can connect with the indwelling presence, where the spirit bears common witness with our spirit, it can and will change your life. This mutually loving gaze is always initiated by God and grace. Once you learn to rest there, nothing less will ever satisfy you. This is foundational. That brought to mind when we read Eddie Hillesum a couple of Sundays ago, where she talked about repose in oneself, that when she finds that place of repose within herself, that place is God. She recognized that place of repose, that place of non-shame and non-judgment out beyond right doing and wrong doing, that is God. And so when we are able to set our ego aside in contemplative practice, then whatever is left after we do that, that is God. That is God's presence, if that's a more comfortable way of putting it for you. Kind of reminds me of Sherlock Holmes. What did he say? When you eliminate all that is impossible, whatever is left, however improbable, must be the truth. When you eliminate all ego, whatever is left has to be God, because that's what's at the bottom of our dog piles every time is going to be God's presence. That's what we're trying to get. It's not a process of addition, it's a process of subtraction, as Meister Eckhart and so many of the mystics keep reminding us. It's not what we think it is. It's the exact opposite. And of course, that's what Jesus was saying all the time. You want to find your life, you have to lose it. You want to sit at the head of the table, you sit at the foot of the table. If you're not willing to pick up your cross daily, deny yourself and follow me, then you're not going to be able to go where I go. It's over and over and over again. He's trying to give us the same message, but it's a hard one to receive because we aren't wired that way. And our egoic minds are working in the opposite direction. So we literally have to be salmon swimming against the current of our own minds, to be able to pull this off. But it can be done. It may be difficult. It's always difficult and maybe more difficult for some of us, but it can be done. And it doesn't have, you're not going to do it 100% of the time. Get that out of your minds right now. It's not a switch that you throw. It's choices that you make momentarily that add up eventually to that 51% where your character has been changed. So, all
By the
right.
way, one of the reasons why Jung was fascinated with dreams and symbols and a number of things is that he, among other reasons, said that it is in those kinds of experiences where we forget ourselves and this kind of thing can happen. For instance, in a dream, you're not, there's this thing you're experiencing and it's being generated by the egoic mind or the shadow or whatever. But you're not in control of it. It's there to observe. And there's lessons in it. The same in surprises, he said. If something surprises you, if something happens and you begin to laugh, for this moment, you've forgotten yourself. And you're experiencing this thing without thinking about it. And so he was interested in those kinds of experiences because he thought that they were doors opening to the authentic self.
Same reason that word associations were so important in his work as well. And their timing, how quickly you respond, and you're not supposed to think. It's just they say a word, you respond to it. What's the first thing in your mind? And you're in that same space that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is where we're trying to get. We're trying to get to awareness without thinking about it. That's the goal, or what Cynthia Bourgeault calls choiceless awareness, awareness without choosing to bring your focus to a point on any one thing, which would be a thought. We're trying to do that without thought, and it takes us into a whole different space. All right, need to stop there. Good session again tonight. I know I did most of the talking, but you all were scoring as well. Okay, Scotty.
Thank you, Lord, for this time with you and with each other. And what a journey we're on, Lord. It's amazing when we slow down long enough to pay attention to it. It's quite an incredible thing. We're grateful for the time we spend together and connections that we make. We ask you, Lord, to just keep us on the straight and narrow path. Be gentle when necessary and forceful when we're not paying attention, but do it in whatever way you see fit, Lord. Just help us to travel the right road, to set aside the distractions and the things that take us away from the truth of who you are and what you're about and what you created us for. Let us just stay focused on seeking you in all our choices and letting you, like Pastor Dave says, letting you motivate us and animate us and keep us going. We're grateful, Father. We thank you for everything. We love you. We praise you and glorify you in whatever manner we find possible to stay connected with you. Jesus, it's in your name, in your essence, in your very being that we find the peace that we're looking for and find the right direction in the road we're traveling. We love you, Lord. In your holy, precious name we pray and give our thanks and say our amens. Amen.
Amen. All right. So we'll see you all Friday for soak and Sunday morning, and we will be on Zoom if you want, if you're remote and want to log in. We'll be there for you. Bye.
Bye,
See you
everyone.
guys.
Good
Bye.
night, everyone.
See you soon. Bye, Jordana.
Good night. Good night. Good
Bye.
night.
See you
Good
Friday.
night, guys.
See ya. See ya. Bye, Jordana. See you Sunday. See you Friday.
Yeah, see you Friday and Sunday.
Okay, cool. All right.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.